McGrenere.
McGrenere. So I'd like to give them their award for honourable mention and a round of applause.
Thanks.
And take it away.
Okay. So I had to change computers, and I had a bunch of nice demos for you guys, so if there's any technical issues, please bear with me. All right, third day at Kai. I'm sure you've seen tons of cool new designs and new ways of interacting with technology. In this talk, I would like to bring your attention to something that is not new and really not very exciting. Settings panels. Arguably one of the least glamorous UIs you can think of, and yet all of us are familiar with them. And in fact, they've been around for a while. So this is on the Xerox stars back in the 80s, the lovely gray of Windows 95, and even more modern operating systems have them. And so we started by asking this question: why are these things so prevalent? It doesn't seem that users love them. And in fact, there are many reasons not to love them, as you must be aware. And it also comes down to this notion of gulf of execution between what we're familiar with, the interface of the app you want to customize, and what you're given to customize it, the settings panel. And in this project, we try to bridge this gap by anchoring settings to the application UI. So let me show you what I mean exactly by that. So this is Wunderlist. It's a task management app that we use as a basis during this project. And the idea is to replace the settings panel by this, a layer on top of the interface that maintains you in the same context, but highlights in white the different UI elements that have settings associated with them. So if I click on the input box, I can change the option of adding settings at the top of the list or the bottom of the list. I can change the keyboard shortcut associated with this action. If I click, for instance, on the date, I will see options related to formatting the date and formatting the time. So there's more to this design, of course, but for the moment, let's just say that we implemented three variants of it, and we will show that two of these were 35% faster than traditional settings panels. But first, we had to check the feasibility of our ideas. Does it even make sense? So we reviewed 20 applications, both on mobile and desktop. And first, we just recorded carefully what customization mechanisms they were providing. And we found that all but one of them were using settings panels, and we didn't find any differences between desktop and mobile apps in this regard. So the interaction paradigm is the same, even though sometimes they might look slightly different. We then went on to evaluate the feasibility of this idea of anchoring settings to UI elements. And we categorized about 400 settings from these different apps. We found that 50% of settings were directly anchorable to the interface. So what do I mean by that? If you have a UI element like this button, I'm talking about settings that have a direct impact on this button. So for instance, it can change the style, the position, or even hide completely this element from the interface. Another 32% of settings were indirectly anchorable. So based on some sort of conceptual relationship. So for instance, if I have this notification settings like activating emails or pop-up notifications, it makes sense to link them with, for instance, this notification icon that you have in many applications. They are not exactly the same, but there is this relationship between the two. And finally, we found that only 16% of settings were not anchorable anywhere, and this typically corresponds to more advanced settings like enabling encryption or setting a backup frequency of your data. But overall, 84% of settings were anchorable, so we were happy. Our approach somewhat made sense. All right, let's look a little bit at the design. We were inspired by the notion of direct activation back from 2001, and also the contextual help literature, because it tackles some somewhat similar problems of bringing information to an interface. But let's step back a little bit and think about settings. So you can think of them as this long list of key value pairs of parameters. And really, a config file is a direct textual representation of these. Another approach is to categorize settings based on similarity. And if you put these in the different tabs of the settings panels, you have a simple graphical user interface. Our approach, however, wanted to use the application UI itself to organize settings. So we split settings into small chunks, and we associate each chunk with one UI element, represented here with this little color dots, and it gives us a many-to-many mapping between UI elements and settings. The second dimension of our design space is how to display this mapping to the user. So we designed 3 variants. The minimal one that you've seen before simply shows the settings associated with the element you clicked on. So it's very simple, very minimal, but it lacks all the structure that a traditional settings panel would provide, because designers typically would carefully organize the settings together. So we bring back some of this structure in the minimal plus context variant by displaying next to each setting the tab that it comes from. So maybe you can't read, but here it says shortcuts and smart list, 2 different types of settings. In the full plus highlight variant, we reproduce the familiar structure of the settings panel, and we simply highlight in orange the settings that are associated with the element that you clicked. So as you can see, these 3 variants vary in information richness from low to high. There are 2 other important design decisions that we made, and I think for these I will just show you a little demo. As you remember, there were these 60% of settings that we didn't know how to anchor in the interface. So we need a way to access these. What we propose is that even in this minimal variant, you have this little show all link at the bottom. You can click. It will expand to the full settings panels that you can then browse as you would normally. And of course, you can collapse it back to what it was before. In the minimal plus context variant, you can simply click on the tab name to expand the panel. It might be hard to notice it on this screen, but we have these smooth transitions between the different states where the settings will glide to their new position, which helps preserve the mental model of what is going on. So really here what we're building is a multi-layer interface. This concept was introduced by Ben Schneiderman a while ago, and basically you go from information-reduced interfaces to information-rich interfaces. All right, another key characteristic of settings is the fact that they modified the interface, right? But we use the interface to access settings. So we can get caught in a loop. For instance, here, there's a setting to hide this particular element from the sidebar. And if I do this, by definition, it will be gone. So how can I bring it back? For this, we introduced the notion of ghost anchors that by default we hide under this collapse icon. When I click on it, it reveals in dark gray ghost anchors that represent elements that can be added in the interface, so somewhat floating around. You can then access their own settings, set it to visible if you would like, and bring it back to your interface. Okay. So we ran 2 experiments to test this idea in our prototypes. And I have to say, for those of you who are not very familiar with this part of personalization, it's generally very difficult to test customization systems, because customization is something that happens very infrequently and over a very long period of times. But in our experiment, we focused on the usability of customization mechanisms, because that's the problem we've identified with settings panels. They're just not very usable. To increase the ecological validity of our experiment, we decided to run it with a real-world application, so Wunderlist, and we chose it because it is well-designed, its settings panels is well-designed, and so we thought it would be just a fair comparison with our approach. It also offers a bunch of varied settings, so it was overall a good a good candidate. Just to give you a quick tour of our prototype, Wunderlist has this web application UI that is customizable with a settings panel. And under the hood, it is synced with a data store that contains all the settings. Our own prototype is written in JavaScript and sits on top of their interface. And it is linked with another data store that contains a copy of the settings. And the trick is that we managed to link these two data stores so that changing a setting in our interface created the impression that we were customizing Wunderlist itself. Or at least that's how we thought it would work, because we realized at some point in pilot testing that this link sometime didn't really work. And even worse, there were some actual bugs in Wunderlist in the way they treated settings. So we ended up basically taking over the UI and overriding it with our own version of the settings, which was a lot of fun. All right, we ran 2 studies, one on mechanical Turk, one on our lab. And for the first one, we had 48 participants. It was a between-subject design because we were concerned about negative transfer effects between the different conditions. The task was to find and change settings spread into 2 blocks of 20. We had 4 conditions, the 3 interfaces that you've seen, and a control condition, which was the settings panel of Wunderlist that we instrumented for this experiment. We measured, among other things, the duration, the time it took participants to change a setting, and I will show on this graph 95% confidence intervals. So here's what we found. As you can see, the minimal variant was significantly faster than the full plus highlight variant in the control condition. However, there were no other significant differences. So here, minimal is the clear winner. But when you think about it, it is a bit surprising because really it's not that different from minimal plus context, which only adds these little 2 tabs on the side. So that's something we wanted to investigate in our second experiment. This time it was in the lab, 12 participants within subjects, because we wanted participants to be able to compare subjectively the different conditions, but otherwise similar protocol. And we found the same p-value, pretty much the same effect size, except that this time it was the minimal plus context variant that was faster than the others, whereas in the previous experiment it was the minimal variant. So this time minimal plus context is the clear winner. And of course this is not the kind of thing you want in an experiment, but to understand it better we had to dig a little more in our data and considered such strategies. So imagine you're a participant and you're given a task to change a setting in this interface. For instance, the date format. You have 2 ways of doing it. The first one is to look around the UI, see for instance the date here, click on it, and the date format will be displayed here and you can change it from this mini pop-up. But we noticed that many participants were following another strategy, which is to click on any element, expand the panel, and then use it as they are familiar with by browsing tabs and reading text labels until they found the one that they wanted. And you know, they could change it here since we provided access to everything. And so maybe I won't go into too many details, but we can plot the distribution of our participants based on these 2 strategies. And we found that participants, about half of them were first looking for an anchor and then clicking on it and then changing the settings, what we call the UI anchor search, whereas the other half was using mostly the traditional text label search approach. So when you have this kind of bimodal distribution of your participants, kind of like across all conditions, it's pretty, let's say that, something you don't want in an experiment. Unfortunately, we saw the same thing in our lab study, except that this time there was a higher number of participants, which was the anchor search. Okay, so what does it mean? It means that the search strategy that participant chose was a confounding variable that our experiment design couldn't account for, because it really just depending on participants' individual differences. So what we did is run a differential analysis, which is basically splitting the two groups based on the two different search strategies that they were using. And in that case, we found that minimal and minimal plus context variants fared similarly well, and they were both faster than the control condition. So to sum up, this inconsistency of results that we first found came down to this other variable that we had to account for. All right, a few key takeaways. Settings panels are everywhere. They're the default standard in the industry for customizing application, but it's not necessarily because they're particularly good at it. We introduced the concept of anchored customization to map settings to UI anchors. We implemented this concept in our customization layer prototype as an alternative to settings panels. And we showed that two variants, minimal and minimal plus context, were faster by about 35% than settings panels. And with that, I would like to thank you for dealing with my French accent so long, and I'm happy to take any questions.
We're on schedule just about, so we have time for a couple of questions if they're not too challenging. You see who you are.
Yes, Charles Hill, Oregon State University. I was wondering, I know that you found that your customizations were faster, but did you get a sense of how the participants felt about the UI?
Right, so we did ask that, especially in the lab study, but we didn't find any strong differences. Basically, they were all participants were fairly happy with all different conditions in terms of ease of use, perceived performance, and this kind of metrics. There's definitely a trade-off between familiarity and efficiency, but what we found is that after a couple trials in these new ways of changing settings, as soon as participants got the way, like the mental model, basically, you click on something to see settings associated with them, then they were fine with it and actually seemed to like it better.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Weir Jordesma from Philips.
Mm-hmm.
You looked at the mechanism for customization, which I think looked really nice.
Mm-hmm.
But a key problem with customization is often that users don't customize at all. So did you
Mm-hmm.
look into whether this interface also improves the motivation to customize?
Right, so that's why I said we focused on the usability and not whether it would actually lead to more customization in the future. We can only hypothesize that. And it would be interesting to run, I didn't mention that for future work, but it would be interesting to deploy that prototype maybe as a browser extension to actual Wunderlist users and see if it changes behavior. Our hypothesis is that since settings panels are not usable, no one wants to even deal with them and try it out. So we hope that by providing a more usable mechanism, it would lead to more customization. Another thing I can mention is the point of this layer is that it gives you a sense of what is customizable in this interface. So you might have gone to it to change, I don't know, again, this date format, but you may realize, oh, there is actually this, I can change, where items are put in the list. So, yes.
Okay, we'll get time for the last one if you want to ask it, but if you want to maybe, Jacob, if you could
Sure.
set up while we're...
Oh, yeah, that would be easy. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ji Young from Tableau. Did you give any thought on the customization on the non-anchorable UI elements? For example, maybe how to zoom, like zoom behavior.
Right.
Yeah.
So, sorry. So for the moment, we simply provide you access to a traditional settings panels for these. Another approach is to have a list of things that are not anchorable anywhere. However, I think in many cases, you can rely on these informal relationships between things. So for instance, a zoom, you could have, I don't know, a zoom icon somewhere in your interface that is related to that, or just a view icon. And you can, I would suggest to put this kind of settings in this anchor.